The First World War ended on Monday, the 11th of November, 1918. It was the 100th day of the 5th year of the war. Early that morning, representatives of the opposing sides met in a railway carriage at Compiègne in France, where the armistice document to end the war was officially signed at 5 a.m. Hostilities on all fronts would cease in 6 hours' time at 11 a.m. As news of the armistice spread around the world, people anxiously watched their clocks and waited. Winston Churchill, Minister for Munitions, was in London that morning. I stood at the window of my room looking up Northumberland Avenue towards Trafalgar Square, waiting for Big Ben to tell that the war was over. My mind strayed back across the scarring years to the scene and emotions of the night at the Admiralty, when I listened to these same chimes in order to give the signal of war against Germany to our fleets and squadrons across the world. And now all was over. Then suddenly the first stroke of the chime. I looked again at the broad street beneath me. It was deserted. From the portals of one of the large hotels absorbed by government departments darted the slight figure of a girl clerk, distractedly gesticulating while another stroke resounded. Then from all sides men and women came scurrying into the streets. Streams of people poured out of the buildings. The bells of London began to clash. Northumberland Avenue was now crowded with people in hundreds, nay, thousands, rushing hither and thither in a frantic manner, shouting and screaming with joy. I could see that Trafalgar Square was already swarming. Around me, in our very headquarters at the Hotel Metropole, disorder had broken out. Doors banged, feet clackered down corridors. Everyone rose from the desk and cast aside pen and paper. All bounds were broken. The tumult grew. It grew like a gale, but from all sides simultaneously. The street was now a seething mass of humanity. Flags appeared as if by magic. Streams of men and women flowed from the embankment. They mingled with torrents pouring down the Strand on their way to acclaim the King. Almost before the last stroke of the clock had died away, the strict, war-straitened streets of London had become a triumphant pandemonium. My wife arrived, and we decided to go and offer our congratulations to the Prime Minister, on whom the central impact of the whole struggle had fallen in his hour of recompense. But no sooner had we entered our car than 20 people mounted upon it, and in the midst of a wildly cheering multitude, we were impelled slowly forward through Whitehall. In Melbourne, on the other side of the world, the first news of Germany's acceptance of the Allies' terms was conveyed in an official message from America. Newspaper officers in Collins Street were the first to receive the message shortly after 7 p.m., and about 100 people were in front of the Age office when the cablegram was posted up. Men and women looked at the boards as if they could scarcely believe what they read. There was no immediate demonstration, but in some mysterious way, the news travelled like lightning across the city. And for an increasingly war-weary public, its significance was quickly grasped. People came hurrying towards Collins Street, spreading the news on the way. Doubts were expressed as to whether the message had actually been received, and all were intent upon seeing the wonderful words in black and white. Telephone bells began to ring, and soon the exchange had to deal with a tremendous rush of calls. Nearly all the subscribers' lamps on the manually operated switchboards of the central telephone exchange were glowing simultaneously. Every available operator was recalled for duty as people clamoured for numbers to pass on the glad tidings to their friends. But owing to the excessive pressure on the telephone system, many people in the suburbs heard the news first from city train passengers and engine drivers. Everywhere there was joy, deep, unrestrained, heartfelt joy. People assembled in the streets singing songs and setting off fireworks. Bells began to peal, and from tin whistles to kerosene tins, every variety of portable or hastily improvised musical instruments were played. But from every direction people sought a way to the city. Trams, trains, motors, and other vehicles were crowded with those who were eager to join in the big celebration. Every incoming train from 7:30 to 10:30 disgorged a full load of passengers. Before 10 o'clock, the inner suburbs were practically deserted. In street scenes unparalleled in the history of Melbourne, along every avenue leading to the city came joyous crowds, cheering, singing, shouting, and laughing at the Allied triumph. Their songs echoed throughout the night. The little knot of people outside the Age Office soon swelled into thousands as people poured into the city. Collins Street became more and more congested, till it was one dense mass from Russell Street to beyond Elizabeth Street. Opposite the Argus newspaper office in Collins Street, boys climbed trees and perched like monkeys among the branches. A boy and girl sat solemnly on top of the traffic sign at the corner of Collins and Swanston Streets. Hundreds of people used the tramcars, which were forced to stop on the hill in Collins Street as temporary grandstands. Some irrepressible spirits even lifted the vehicles from their lines and carried or wheeled them to unaccustomed places to use as vantage points. And boys who had got on the iron verandas in Swanston Street added to the din by pounding on them with sticks. The bells of St. Patrick's Cathedral, loudly ringing, could not be heard in the heart of the city. The Great War had ended. The years of sorrow and agony were over, and Melbourne rejoiced. The pent-up feelings of 4 years were released as the first cheer rang out. 3 cheers for the boys at the front. Hooray, responded the crowd, and hooray, again and again. Then a single voice began the first notes of Rule Britannia. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves, came in a mighty roar that resolved into cheering. More songs followed, with Soldiers of the King, Over There, Keep the Home Fires Burning, and the cheery lilt of Pack Up Your Troubles. But the crowd returned over and over to God Save the King. It was repeated 100 times during the night, and the great assembly, the men standing with bare heads, voiced the words with fervour and then cheers. Similar scenes were repeated in Melbourne's theatres and dance halls. At Her Majesty's, where Hello Everybody was playing, the signing of the Armistice was announced from the stage. The curtain rose with all the performers, together with the show's producer, Mr. George Barnum, gathered in front of the footlights. The Marseillaise was sung in French by Mr. Jack Cunnett. Miss Pearl Ladd followed with The Star-Spangled Banner, after which Miss Minnie Love sang God Save the King. Great cheering followed, which was echoed behind the scenes as various staff members joined in. In Burke Street at the Theatre Royal, the first act of The High Cost of Loving had just finished. As the performers were recalled to respond to the applause, the full company appeared carrying flags of the Allies. Miss Maggie Moore, coming to the front of the stage, announced on behalf of the management that news of the armistice had been confirmed. The audience rose and cheered enthusiastically. Miss Moore, an American, then sang the Star-Spangled Banner, leading with characteristic fervour and enthusiasm as the audience joined in. The Marseillaise and the national anthem were then sung by the entire audience in succession, and finally, in answer to insistent calls, Rule Britannia. At the Palais, where skating and dancing were in progress, 500 couples dwindled to half a dozen in a few minutes after news of events in the city became known. As the night advanced, firecrackers snapped and banged and curled up over the heads of people, leaving little trails of sparks. But as the crowd increased, some remarkable pranks were played by the more boisterous elements. In the first flush of enthusiasm, groups of youths and men were content to sit on top of the tramcars as they crawled through the city. But later, after the traffic had been stopped and the cars were lying stationary on the various route bases, crowds of men and women seized the cars and lifted them bodily off the tracks. After marching up the street gathering a volume of recruits on the way, one group attacked the Carlton cable tram. They dragged the dummy into Lonsdale Street along the slight decline that leads to Elizabeth Street. Then, cheering and shouting, they started the journey. Inside and on top of the car were excited men and hysterical women. The tramcar gained momentum and, after travelling some distance, attained a speed that was nearly dangerous for the adventurous passengers. Apparently they did not care. The solitary constable on the scene set off after the flying tram. It was too much for the crowd. They seized the policeman and, hoisting him shoulder high, ran after the car, which was stopped before any damage was done. Another Melbourne cable tram seized later that night in Lonsdale Street was not so lucky. It was hauled by the crowd along Queen Street and shot down the Queen Street hill until it crashed into the curb opposite the Australian General Electric Company's office. Windows smashed, the wheels broke, and the crowd, unable to vent its enthusiasm any longer, dispersed. 2 trams were also derailed in Swanston Street, and despite the entreaties of officials, were hauled down Little Burke Street to the Chinese quarters. The Chinese hastily barricaded their shops, but it was noticeable that many men and boys left the lane with quantities of firecrackers. The huge crowd began to thin after 11 p.m. Trains and trams bound for the suburbs were full, and the last trains packed beyond capacity. Most people managed to somehow squeeze in, with the remainder left to walk home. However, it was long past midnight before the last groups dispersed, the last cracker exploded, and the last cheer given for the armistice. The government proclaimed the following day a public holiday throughout the Commonwealth. All hotels within a radius of 15 miles of the city, as well as those in larger regional centres, were ordered to remain closed. The government especially desired mayors and presidents of municipalities to gather their citizens in halls or parks for meetings and the passage of suitable resolutions. Most of Melbourne's inhabitants managed to snatch a few hours' sleep, while others stayed up all night. Many of those who went to sleep were awakened very early by the loud and prolonged shrieking of factory whistles, some of which blew for 2 hours on end. In the city, streets were thronged from early morning, but the hysteria of the previous night had given way to profound feelings of pride and patriotism. Flags fluttered from every flagpole. Flags were carried in almost every hand. Flags fluttered from tramcars and countless motor cars. Flags in miniature were in every blouse front and coat lapel, and in almost every hat. But through all the joyful enthusiasm ran a dominant note of thanksgiving. Immense crowds gathered in all the churches for services of thanksgiving for victory. At midday, a special service of thanksgiving was held at the Melbourne Town Hall. Every available space was occupied. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered and special hymns sung by the large congregation. When Dame Nellie Melba sang the national anthem, the audience stood and cheered wildly, and the verse, "God Save Our Splendid Men," was rendered. Dame Nellie Melba then consented to sing "Home, Sweet Home," which was listened to with deep emotion by everyone present. Women wept without restraint, and many men could be seen furtively wiping their eyes. At the conclusion of the first verse, the singer herself broke down and rushed from the stage. Then cheering broke out with additional enthusiasm. Dame Nellie Melba was brought back, but was too overcome to sing the second verse. She stood on the stage silently for some seconds. Suddenly, she kissed her hands to the audience and again left the stage. The greatest war mankind had ever known was over. But for Australians, victory had come at a terrible cost. From a population of fewer than 5 million, 416,809 men enlisted. Over 60,000 were killed, and 156,000 were wounded, gassed, or taken prisoner. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row. On this special day, we remember with pride the efforts and sacrifice of all those who served Australia in times of war. Lest we forget.
When this blasted war is over, no more soldiering for me. When I get my civvy clothes on, oh, how happy I will be. I shall sound my own reveille. I shall make my own tattoo. No more NCOs to curse me, no more bloody army stew.
NCOs will all be navvies, privates ride in motor cars. NCOs will smoke their woodbines, privates puff their big cigars. No more standing two in trenches, only one more church parade. No more shivering on the fire step, no more Conchi's marmalade.
The Day World War I Ended was written by Greg Alabaster and narrated by Maurice Lockie.